Welcome to Chatter. I'm Katherine Pompilio, Associate Editor at Lawfare, and the first of several guest hosts from Lawfare joining Shane Harris and David Priest in bringing you Chatter episodes. This week, Lawfare Editor-in-Chief Benjamin Wittes on his so-called special military operations against the Russians.
It was a few days after the election. I drove by the embassy just because it's in my neighborhood. And, I noticed for the first time that it was a giant white-faced building that looked like a movie screen. I want people to be thinking about the people who are being injured, killed, displaced. And I want them to be thinking about the people whose voices they're not hearing. You always have to ask, wait a minute, how much of this is ego and how much of this is actually being helpful? And there's a complicated mix there.
Hi, Ben Wittes. Welcome to Chatter.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to be here. We're in studio, which is...
we are in the old jungle studio, which all it needs now, it's been refurbished, and all it needs now is plants.
So do plants make the jungle studio the jungle?
That is why it was called the jungle studio, because it was lush with plants and scotch.
Scotch, yeah, I've heard about that.
But now the plants all died during the pandemic, so it was the deforested jungle studio for a while, and now it is ready for an ecological reboot.
And no scotch, too. Is that coming back? Or?
Oh, yes.
Okay, great. So again, welcome to Chatter. I was talking in preparation for this. I noticed that you've never been on a Chatter episode.
Correct.
And Chatter is a product that you helped launch. How does it? I'm going to get meta here, but how does it feel being on Chatter? You are the subject of Chatter now. Yeah,
so that's an interesting question. So Chatter is one of the Lawfare products that I approved and kind of in a very distant sense supervised, but have never directly been involved in. It started, I want to say a year or two ago when David Priest and Shane Harris approached me with the idea for it. And I liked the idea very much, but I already had my hands full with the Lawfare podcast and with all the other things we do. And so I told them, by all means, do it. And but it's, not something I'm going to be directly involved in, which delighted them because I don't think they actually wanted my prying hands in their podcast. So I have listened to Chatter regularly with great pleasure, and I have approved of Chatter and enjoyed Chatter. And I have also very much enjoyed the fact that Chatter is not my podcast. It is one of Lawfare's children that is not something that I'm directly editorially involved in. So yeah, this is my first Chatter.
Well, this is also my first Chatter, so I'm glad that we get to go through this together.
Exactly. By the end of it, we'll be bonded by blood.
Yeah, and David and Shane, watch out. That's all I have to say. So we're here to talk about your special military operations, which we will get into. But I just kind of wanted to touch on things like, also for listeners who don't know, I'm Katherine. I'm an associate editor at Lawfare. Ben is my boss. And things like your special military operation and In Lieu of Fun and other projects like that are explicitly not Lawfare products, unlike Chatter and other things. But a lot of attention comes to them from Lawfare, and I feel like vice versa. Where do you draw the line between your day job and other projects?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's one I spend a lot of time navigating, actually, because in my own life, I don't really draw much of a line between the professional and the personal. Not that I'm constantly working or anything, but the lines that, what I consider recreational, a lot of other people might consider work. And so during the pandemic, for example, I decided that one thing I decided this very early in the pandemic, that one thing I needed in order to keep myself sane was to have a social hour with people every day. And the only way I could think of doing that would actually force me to really do it was to say to a friend who turned out to be Kate Klonick, hey, do you want to do a show with me every day? And we'll have a live audience and we will have a friend on and we'll have a drink and we'll shoot the shit. And that became In Lieu of Fun. And it was named In Lieu of Fun by some wag who, thought it was a good name, which I agreed with. And so, a lot of people might say, whoa, doing a daily live show, that's work. Mm-hmm. But for me, that was just kind of something to force myself to not be lonely, to be to reach out to friends who I might otherwise not have occasion to reach out to, mm-hmm. to build a community of people who were, wanted to similarly have a drink with what one of them called my imaginary friends every day. And so I didn't really think of it as work. The reason we didn't do it under the banner of Lawfare was, number one, that it was going to treat issues far beyond the scope of Lawfare. It was going to, if we had an interesting person on to talk about crows, which we did. No, we had multiple people on to talk about corvids and their intelligence and stuff. And that's really just beyond the scope of Lawfare. And we sort of wanted the flexibility to do it. They're some of the best episodes that we did. Also, we had a Wall Street Journal reporter on to talk about content moderation, which would have been, very Lawfare-y, except that he was sitting in front of a live beehive at the time, and all we wanted to – he turned out to be a very serious beekeeper, and he had incredible live video of going into this beehive that we did. So all we did was ended up talking to him about bees.
Amazing.
And so, there was just – for In Lieu of Fun, it was just a little bit beyond the scope of – or a lot beyond the scope of what Lawfare does. And I try to be careful about keeping Lawfare's brand pretty pure. As you know from our editorial meetings, I'm the sort of cop of not letting Lawfare treat issues that are not within its jurisdiction. And I try to observe that in my own life too. So a lot of episodes of In Lieu of Fun would be good Lawfare content, but a lot of them wouldn't. And if you know that a lot of it's going to be beyond the scope of Lawfare, probably better to do it outside of Lawfare's orbit. Mm-hmm. The special military operations, and for those who don't know what that term refers to, that is my joking reference to the protests that I've been doing for the last year that have involved shining various types of lights on the Russian embassy compound here in Washington and elsewhere. I have not done under the auspices of Lawfare because though thematically within Lawfare's orbit, it's frankly a form of activism, and I don't think Lawfare should ever be involved in activism of any kind, even mine, even the kinds that I am most sympathetic to. And so I don't see a conflict, but I do think it's important that they be on the side. I don't want Lawfare to have an institutional position on shining lights on embassy compounds. I'm not sure what that would be, but I don't think that's a healthy thing for Lawfare to be doing. I do think it's a healthy thing for me to be doing. And so I've just kind of done that on my own. And then the related matters that I do on my own that sort of interact with Lawfare but are not of Lawfare are my Twitter feed, which of course is now defunct thanks to Twitter's bizarre new content moderation policies, and my Substack, which is the sort of inheritor of my Lawfare of my Twitter feed. It's kind of the incidental writing and thought that is sometimes Lawfare relevant, but is often just as today's was a video of a call to defect that we projected onto the Russian embassy, or sometimes every day I try to highlight a particular animal that did something fun, and that's the beast of the day, and that's always going to be that just doesn't have much to do with Lawfare except when it's a truly extraordinary beast.
Exactly. So you've touched on this a little bit in this conversation, but for those who are unfamiliar, they're hearing lights, projection, embassy, defect. Could you paint us a picture of what the special military operation is? What's a typical one of those?
Yeah, so none of them is typical. Some of them involve lights. Most of them involve lights, but some of them don't. One of the most successful one was during the daytime, and it involved planting sunflowers. What they all involve is, I'm going to use this word very deliberately, the harassment of Russian diplomats. And the goal of them is, one way or another, to, with good fun and humor, make life less pleasant to be a Russian diplomat in a Western democratic country. Most of these have taken place in Washington, but we did one in Ottawa. We did one in Paris. I don't advise trying that. We came very close to getting arrested in Paris. And we will be doing a swing through the Nordic countries sometime over the summer. So the basic concept is that the United States has an obligation under the Vienna Convention to protect the embassy, and every country that hosts an embassy has such an obligation, and I respect that, and I don't want to interfere with that. I don't want to create an environment in which diplomacy is harder to do. I do want to register in the strongest of terms the fact that civilized countries don't host genocidal governments without comment, and that there are a lot of people who have to live in that neighborhood, and I'm one of them. I live a mile and a half from the Russian embassy, and I drive by it all the time, and I walk by it all the time. And for a lot of people who live in that neighborhood, there's some experience of disruption and upset that you get every time you have to pass it and you see the comfortable environment in which we are hosting people who are actively speaking on behalf of and representing the killing and displacement and kidnapping of large numbers of people and rape. And so the goal is to invade that space without actually violating any laws or doing anything that is inconsistent with the United States' obligations to protect that embassy and let it function. You can't do that with noise, particularly not at night, because there are other neighbors involved and because there's a DC noise ordinance. You can't do it with projectiles. If you throw things over the walls, you will get arrested. And by the way, you should. You can't do it with signs, because signs stay on the other side of the wall. And so the question that led to the special military operation was, how do you do it? How do you get into that space as literally as possible without actually violating any of the rules. And the solution to that problem was light. So the classic special military operation is you take a spotlight or more recently a laser projector and you shine it on the wall of the embassy, which is approximately 300 feet away, and you do it with a message that is as offensive as humanly possible to the people inside the embassy. Think of a Ukrainian flag. Think of a map of Ukraine with Crimea and the eastern parts of the country integrated into the map. Think of slogans, and you try to force the embassy staff to react somehow. And they react in a number of different ways, as I'm sure we'll discuss. And those reactions you film, and that filming becomes the excitement of the episode.
So in addition to flags and maps, what else have you projected, and what messages are you sending to diplomats?
Yeah, so we've done a few different projects, and again, these have been at different locations. So in the main embassy compound, you have a limited, because the distance is so long, you have to keep images very, very simple. So we've done the flag, the map, the Ukrainian trident, which is called the trizub, many, many, many different slogans. So the laser lets us write on the walls, which is super fun. So sometimes we team up with a group of Ukrainian activists and they chant slogans. And when they chant them, we display the symbol, the slogans that they're chanting. Elsewhere, we've also done images of sunflowers, images that have been drawn for us by the NAFO fellows, the group of graphic artist activists who work on Twitter. And then on the backside of the embassy, where you can get much closer, and in other locations, we've done much more elaborate slideshows showing war crimes, for example. We did a display of work by a Kharkiv-based artist who had done some sort of split image work that I thought was really amazing. So we did a whole slideshow of his work on the Russian Cultural Center. We tried to show a movie once. That didn't work too well. And we've done – I'm trying to think what else. And we did a display by a projection artist in Odessa whose work we featured once. So we've tried to do a variety of things. Oh, and most ambitiously of all, sorry, I forgot the most interesting one. We did this woman who had survived Bucha wrote an essay for us to project, and we projected it line by line with on the embassy with a live voice voicing it, which we created, I think, a very powerful video out of. That was back on February 24th. So, and then more recently, we did a poem where we did the same basic idea, which is somebody, reading it aloud while we're projecting it. And the poem, which actually we just posted the video of today, that included a call for embassy officials to defect. So that's, again, designed to be deliberately obnoxious and provocative.
I remember you did a live from Ukraine episode with the woman who survived the Bucha attack.
Yes.
What was her essay about?
So her essay was so Katya had written a diary of her 9 days under occupation in Bucha, and I had read it. She'd had it translated and edited and posted on Medium, and I thought it was really moving and well done and complicated and interesting. So I asked her to do an episode of Live from Ukraine with me. That was literally the only time we've ever spoken. But we've corresponded a fair bit. And I asked her to write an essay that she would want projected onto the embassy. And she did it. It is, I would say, a letter from her to the people in the building, and about, it's at one level the story of how she's a twice refugee. She was a refugee from eastern Donbass, where she's originally from, where she had to flee in 2014. And then in a kind of fleeing Hiroshima for Nagasaki kind of way, she settled in Bucha, where, they're like, yeah, you don't, I guess you don't get to choose where the next place to be invaded is. And so it's kind of about that sequence, but it's also about the psychology of how she sees the people in the building, how she sees Ukraine, and I found it very moving. And so I had my friend Luda read it. It was written in Ukrainian, and we translated it. And then I had Luda read it in both English and Ukrainian, and we created and we projected it in both languages. And then it took a lot of editing to get it in a video form that worked, but it was done in front of a live audience. And, the goal of these things is both to do for a live audience, but also to create a lasting record that goes well beyond the group of people who could be there.
I am not Russian, and I'm obviously not a diplomat, and a lot of these are horrifying images that you're putting up, in addition, just kind of exposing everything that's going on. Have you heard anything from, or have you interacted with any embassy staff?
Sure. So at a basic level, the embassy staff responds to most of these events. They put up their own spotlights by way of interfering with what we're doing. And so there's the distant interaction of competing spotlights, which sometimes gets pretty comical.
Cat and mouse
games where their spotlights are chasing ours around the face of the building. There are, however, more direct interactions too. So the last time we ended up with a pretty extended negotiation with them about when who should take down what spotlights. And the Secret Service, which guards the embassy, actually mediated that negotiation. But sometimes they are more direct than that. So one time, for example, I was working with a friend of mine, and she's Ukrainian American and speaks Russian well. I speak Russian terribly and don't usually try. But she was yelling at them in Russian, and they came out and started filming her, I think because they assumed she was Russian. Oh. And so they do, come out and try to be intimidating sometimes. And then once we were I had a group of very beautiful children lay a bunch of sunflowers, sunflowers being a Ukrainian nationalist symbol, on the driveway of the embassy, and a member of the embassy staff came out and kicked them, not the children, the sunflowers. Mm-hmm. So there are those kind of direct interactions. The other night, they were having a Victory Day party. We were out there because it was Victory Day, which is a kind of sacred day in the Russian calendar. And some of the people leaving that party got into a shouting match with some of the people we were working with. But I guess the most dramatic example is the time that they sent somebody across the street to attack us with umbrellas, and he, came across the street completely unexpectedly and started trying to block the projectors both with his body and with umbrellas, and ended up, poking the projectors with the umbrellas pretty aggressively and chest bumping one of the people that I was working with. So, yeah, I would say the goal is always to provoke a response. Mm-hmm. It's actually, from a theatrics point of view, it's kind of boring if you do a protest and they don't respond. From a videography point of view, it's always the response that's the most interesting thing. When we tried to show a movie, they actively successfully prevented it by just driving a van in front of the projector. And that was the last time we used a giant projector, because we realized at that point we had to be more mobile than that. So we're always trying to provoke a response. We plant sunflowers, they destroy the sunflowers. It's kind of the goal of the special military operations is to capture the response. It's not necessarily to plant the sunflowers. Mm-hmm. It's to film them destroying the sunflowers, which is, by the way, one of my white whales. I know they destroy the sunflowers. I know the sunflowers get destroyed, and I know exactly who's doing it, and I've never been able to capture it on film. Yeah. And I've even installed cameras and had the cameras removed.
Unreal.
No, it's like, talk about cat and mouse. It's like a real spy versus spy thing.
Yeah. You know who it is who's doing it?
To a moral certainty, yes, I know who's doing it. Do I have evidence that I'm right? No. But let's just put it this way. When we capture the images on screen on camera of the person who is doing it, people who have followed special military operations closely will not be surprised at what that person's face looks like.
Need to do a stakeout.
Oh, believe me, I have.
Oh, no. You went in your car and you waited?
I went in my car and stayed all night once.
And nobody came?
Nobody came, and the next night they were destroyed.
They saw you?
They totally made me.
Unreal.
I mean, they are the Russian.
Yeah,
they're good at this shit.
Yeah, that's what they do. So what is it like conducting international negotiations via the Secret Service through a fence or through a wall?
Well, that was the single most surreal experience. Getting attacked by a Russian thug who comes across Wisconsin Avenue and kind of ends up in an umbrella dance, that was pretty surreal. Mm-hmm. But then he goes back across the street. And honestly, if you watch the video of that, we really wore him out. And he's finally just exhausted. Exhausted to the point that he's sweating profusely. Wow. He was almost crying, and he needed water. I think he was probably pretty dehydrated. And
did you talk to him at all?
Yeah, we did. I mean, he said only one sentence to us the whole 45 minutes he was out there. But we tried to get him to defect, actually. And I actually thought we were making some progress with him. I thought he was in an emotionally complicated position, I think. And he finally goes back across the street. And I was this is going to sound egomaniacal, and I really don't mean it that way. except that maybe I'm an egomaniac. But I had genuinely thought we had a working understanding between us and the Secret Service and the Russians. Mm-hmm. And the understanding was nobody had ever written it down. There was no agreement. There were no negotiations. But there was a basic – we'd done this many, many times. And each time there was I think a pretty simple unwritten code, which was we didn't approach the embassy. I always kept my people, nobody threw anything over the walls. There was no spray paint. There was no, we didn't use noise except in a very limited fashion within the terms of the DC noise nuisance regulation, the sound rules. And they stayed in the compound. And if there was an issue, they raised it with the Secret Service, and the Secret Service raised it with us. And they tried to prevent us from shining lights. We shined the lights. We played cat and mouse. But we didn't invade their territory. We respected the rules and they did not come across the street. Mm-hmm. And that basic understanding kept everybody safe. Honestly, it prevents anybody on our side from doing anything stupid, mm-hmm. and it prevents anybody on their side from doing anything stupid and dangerous, like, for example, what President Erdogan did, when his thugs beat a bunch of protesters outside the Turkish embassy and actually outside the Brookings Institution. Oh, wow. And so, there was and that basic rule held until that night on May 9th. I'm sorry, not May 9th, on a couple of weeks earlier. And all of a sudden, and it's an interesting question, why, to which I can speculate, but I honestly don't know the answer. They violated it, and they actually sent somebody across the street mm-hmm. to interfere, not quite violently. He didn't hit anybody, but he didn't keep his hands to himself either. And it required the Secret Service to come across the street and show presence to get him to back off. And so I made a snap judgment at the point at which he went across the street that we couldn't allow that to happen and we needed to push back. And so, again, this may be delusional, but what I decided is our spotlights were not coming down while their spotlights were up, that they had crossed a line. Literally crossed a line. The line was Wisconsin Avenue. Yeah. And it's a big line. It's a big fat line with cars in it. And you cannot cross it by accident, mm-hmm. right? And they sent somebody across the street to be disruptive. And in light of that, I was not going to let them take a picture of us taking down our spotlights and send it back to Moscow with a cable that said the fascist protesters put up spotlights, but we sent, Vladimir across the street and he, bullied them into taking it down. And now the only thing on the wall is, mm-hmm. The Russian Z symbol. Mm-hmm. And so I told them the Secret Service came over and asked me whether I was going to take it down. And I said, not until the Z and V spotlights are down. And so, to my surprise, they offered to communicate that to the Russians. And the result was like a Vienna Cold War kind of scene, which, again, is all on film. Yep. In which the Secret Service goes across to the gates of the embassy, communicates our proposal for a coordinated spotlight turning off sequence to the Russians, and they, send it up the chain of command and come back with a counter proposal. Mm-hmm. And I thought it's like the lesson is maybe the Russians don't, after all, negotiate in good faith. But we had a protracted negotiation through the Secret Service, and it was weird as hell. Yeah. And then I thought we had a deal. In reviewing the tape, it was not 100% clear that they ever fully agreed to the deal.
It was 3, 2, 1, take the lights down, right?
That's what I thought it was. They had 3 spotlights up. We had 2. I proposed we'll take down 1 as a good faith gesture. You take down 2 so that we'll both have 1 up. And then on the Secret Service's 3, 2, 1, we'll both kill them at the same time.
Wow.
And I had thought that the Secret Service said they were okay with that. It turns out maybe what the Secret Service said was they're okay with your taking one of yours down. But it's not. But at the end of the day, they would not take down the 2 once I had taken down my 1. So we put ours back up, and we ended up in a standoff with them that lasted until the sun came up, and no spotlights can compete with the sun.
The
so
ultimate spotlight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the ultimate solar spotlight.
Wow. And for those listening, there's an 18-minute video of this, and it is I'll link to it, but it is one of my, I don't know, it's absolutely riveting just watching you negotiate with these people.
Yeah, and the funny thing about it is, it was like probably at 1 a.m. or something.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what time it was, but it was these poor, weary Secret Service officers who had actually, done yeoman's work protecting us from, I think, what would have been a violent episode, but for their presence. And all they wanted to do was to go home. And I think I put them in a difficult position. They don't like dealing with the Russians. The Russians are pretty abusive toward our law enforcement in a lot of ways, and they ended up in a weird negotiating mediator position in that situation that makes for super fun video, but probably wasn't fun for the individuals in question. They were very good humored about it, but I take this opportunity to apologize for putting them in that position.
I got to say, they have pretty good spirits about it, though. I like the one who said to you, "Don't you want a beer? I know I want a beer."
Yeah, look, we're all repeat players in this game, and I know them reasonably well. Mm-hmm. And I've actually worked with them on a couple of matters that were, that to diffuse situations that could have been difficult. And so I do think there's a level of mutual, trust or whatever. But at the end of the day, they were tired, and
they're people. Also, in the video, one of my favorite things is. Did you film it, or was it someone else who was filming?
I think that one I was sitting there holding up a camera. It was freaking 4 a.m. like late at night.
It's all a blur.
It's all a blur.
There's this amazing. So you can see people from you can see embassy staff coming out through the gates, and there's this amazing. I guess the Office style zoom when you can see, a woman comes down and talks with this agents, and then they come across the street, and it's just, Yeah,
so it's a really interesting problem for the Russians. So on the one hand, think of it from the point of view of a normal embassy or government, right? If this happened at the Swedish embassy, right? They would just ignore it, right? Because everything we're talking about is about their reactions to these. It's not about, we haven't talked about the text of what I've projected, right? We're talking about it because they react. The only reason we did this a second time, we did it the first time, and the only reason there was a second time was that we got this incredible cat and mouse video that's been seen, 10 million times around the world because they chased our stupid spotlight around the building and somebody set it to music.
It was on the news too.
Yeah, no, it was a big deal, but it wasn't a big deal because we put a Ukrainian flag on the building. It was a big deal because they were stupid enough to chase it around the building. So you'd think that after a year of doing this over and over again, they would learn, just ignore it. But here's the problem. They don't operate in an ecosystem in which public relations is what's important. They operate in a highly vertical system of accountability in which if you don't do something, somebody in Moscow says, why didn't you do something about this, right? And no one's going to say, because we didn't want to attract attention to it. There's a kind of, it's like vertically integrated machismo. Everybody is looking up the ladder and afraid that their response won't be chest thumping and, muscle rippling enough for the person above them on the totem pole. And the result is that even if you're the person who's like, why shouldn't we just ignore it? You can't suggest that to the person above you on the totem pole. And so the whole system is rigged in the direction of kind of toxic masculine response. And that's why they're super consistent about it. And so, it's not just that they always respond. They put on tactical gear to respond. They put on masks. They get all dressed up. They showed up once with bulletproof vests and fire extinguishers to respond to a light, because they need to be able to show the people to whom they're answerable to that they did everything that they could to stop this. And the result is that they make all kinds of stupid mistakes. Like, for example, sending a thug across the street with umbrellas, knowing we're live streaming it, right? And to everybody in the world except the one or two people who matter, which is the people above them on the totem pole, that response looks goofy. But to the people above them on the totem pole, that's what's required to show them that you're, flexing your muscle in the face of Ukrainians.
So let's say they listen to this and they stop. Would you stop?
I would not stop entirely because there are still going to be Ukrainian community protests that I will want to show support for. And there are a group of people who I think this makes feel good. And some of them are here, some of them, like literally on the scene, people like it when the projector shows up. And I actually think, showing people in real time, in real space, that you care about what they're going through matters, and that doesn't depend on the Russian response. There are also people in Europe and in the conflict zone who enjoy the social media of it. And so at this point, it has an audience that I don't want to let down. If they did not respond, I would find, in addition to some of this, something else to do that they would respond to. Because I think the highest purpose of these operations is to annoy them. And if I'm not annoying them to the point that they can't just wave it off, I'm not doing it well enough. And I want to find the thing that, in a very like teenage boy kind of way, like the teenage boy who's, I don't want to make this overly gendered, but who, like, the thing that he really can't stand is if the person he's bothering doesn't mind, right? that's how I feel if they don't mind.
I think anybody with siblings gets that. Yeah.
Like I'm really not more than a 13-year-old in that respect.
That's wild. I wanted to go. This is just a question I had because just personally, why is the Secret Service there? Are they? I know they have other jobs aside from protecting the president, but are they there to protect the embassy?
Yeah. So the Secret Service has basically 3 missions. The first and most famous is the Presidential Protective Mission. They also protect foreign embassies and foreign visiting dignitaries. And I think that grew out of the fact that they had this very specialized expertise in protection. Some of that diplomatic protection is done by the Diplomatic Security Service, which is part of the State Department. Mm-hmm. But the Secret Service has the lion's share of the embassy protection function, particularly for embassies that have significant threats associated with them, which the Russian embassy certainly does. So they have the lion's share of that. And then they also have, in a separate function, they have a bunch of jurisdiction over financial crimes of one sort or another, particularly crimes involving forgery and minting fake currency. So they're a weird agency, but I very much prefer to deal with them than all the other agencies. They're a more professional law enforcement agency in my experience than the DipSec people, and in situations in which we've dealt with other law enforcement agencies in these protests, that introduces a real wild card. So the one time we tried to do something in New York at the UN mission, this was not me, but a Confederate who lives in New York. The NYPD was quite abusive to him and to an 11-year-old son of his. That just never would have happened with the Secret Service. When we did the operation in Ottawa, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were lovely, and it was a pleasure dealing with them, and they had no idea what to do. They were perfectly lovely and Canadian about it, but it was, but they didn't have any sense of like, well, what could you and couldn't you do with a light and an embassy, right? Whereas the Secret Service, they've thought about these things enough and they've had enough interactions that they actually they have a very thoughtful set of requests when we do these. They like me to stay on the other side of Wisconsin Avenue, for example, which I don't think they're legally allowed to enforce, but they request it, and I always honor the request. They make a point of making sure that we keep the lights above a certain level so it doesn't blind drivers. They're very good and serious about what they're doing in a way that just helps everything. The RCMP had clearly never dealt with a situation like this before, and there's a very funny video of me and the RCMP guy kind of like, he's like, gosh, I don't know if it's legal. I'm not telling you it's not, but I don't really know. We had a very funny exchange about it. And then the French National Police were awful.
What happened there?
Well, so first of all, I don't quite know because I don't speak French well. I was with a Ukrainian who spoke fluent French and who did the whole negotiation. They were apparently it is not even plausibly legal in Paris to shine lights on an embassy against its will. They stopped us, they detained us, and we kind of talked our way out of it. And over about half an hour of discussions, we kind of won them over. But it took a bit of doing, and I'm quite confident if I had been there alone, I would have been arrested. And I'm equally confident that that the fact that I was with an attractive young woman who one of the cops was clearly interested in probably helped our cause.
Feminism.
Yes.
So is there any international law that governs whether or not this is legal? I know you're working on something about this.
So the international law of embassy protection is the Vienna Convention of 1963, and it, believe it or not, does not say anything about lights. It says that the premises of the embassy shall be inviolate, and the person of the ambassador, it enshrines the concept of diplomatic immunity, and it obliges the host country to protect the embassy. So the question is, protect it from what, right? Clearly, if you take a rocket launcher or a machine gun, right, they got to protect it from that.
Yeah.
And there have been a lot of efforts over the years in different countries to make life super unpleasant for people in embassies, including, by the way, a lot of this has been directed at U.S. embassies. And so the U.S. has a fairly developed view of this. So one case that I know of is the case of the U.S. Embassy Baghdad, where protesters, people associated with the Shia militia in particular, would blare sound at the embassies or would burn tires for weeks at a time to try to create a very unpleasant and, frankly, toxic environment. And the U.S. position, with which I agree, is that actually makes it impossible to use the embassy. And so it interferes with the embassy's day-to-day operations. And so the host government is obliged to put a stop to that. And so we were concerned to not do anything that complicates the U.S. position in situations like that, because the last thing I want is to make U.S. embassy personnel abroad less able to do their jobs. And so we have not used persistent sound, though we have used occasional sound to support the specific protests. We've never used smell. So that's a thing that you can do, right? You can release things that smell really bad. The third is we've never used things like smoke or things that could be toxic and there are a few reasons for that. One is that I actually think it's in conflict with the U.S. obligations under the convention, and I don't want to put my own government in a difficult position. But the second factor that to me is more important than that is the neighbors. One of the biggest sources of support that we've had in these situations is the neighborhood. They, I used to have to bring a generator to these protests. I don't anymore. I just knock on one of the doors and plug into their houses now. They bring us water and beer and stuff. So actually, when the guy asked me, "Don't you want a beer?" I got a beer a few minutes later. Actually, the other, I don't want to do anything that makes it less pleasant to live in that neighborhood. And anything that you do, lights are very focused. They go in one direction. They don't spill out in other directions. You release something that smells bad or burn a tire or something, and that's as unpleasant to be the person next door to the building than it is to be in the building. So I think a whole lot of rules like be a mensch, be decent, actually work legally very well, and they work in terms of neighborly relations very well. And when Umbrella Man came across the street, the thing that finally defeated him was that one of the neighbors brought out a giant ladder, and we just climbed up the ladder with the spotlight, and he couldn't compete with that anymore. So that's when he went back across the street. And that was a creature of our relationship with the neighborhood that just couldn't survive a more aggressive approach to things like sound. I mean, it's hard enough to live next to that embassy, but then you have some assholes show up and blare stuff in the middle of the night. But if we show up in the middle of the night, like 4 a.m, and sidewalk chalk the entire Wisconsin Avenue, that doesn't make a sound. It doesn't bother anybody. But if we blared the Ukrainian national anthem at 4 a.m, that would
might wake them up.
It might wake them up.
Yeah. What about, so we mentioned the giant line, Wisconsin Avenue. Are there traffic laws that prohibit any light? Because I noticed in some videos, you'll be projecting that a bus will come and then there's a flag.
Yeah. So there are probably no laws that affect that. We try to be very careful about not blinding drivers, just for human safety reasons. The lights in question are extraordinarily bright, blindingly bright. And so when a bus comes, I'm always happy for it to shine on the side of the bus, but I don't want it to shine in the windows of the bus. I don't want and the laser in particular, if it shines in somebody's eyes, can be quite dangerous. So we try to be careful about putting our hands or bodies in front of things as necessary in order to protect people's faces and the like.
Wow. And I think one special military operation that we didn't touch upon involved a washing machine.
Yeah, that was the one that really spun out of control. Yeah. So the washing machine, I want to say, was not my operation.
Okay.
I showed up. So I had. This was the project of a woman named Alyam Kent, who is a resident of Kyiv, and she is a Crimean Tatar, half Crimean Tatar, half American. And so she was home visiting family in the Washington area. And she is an artist, a kind of visual artist and of various sorts. And she had decided that she was going to make a washing machine, a paper mache washing machine, and deliver it to the Russian embassy. And she got in touch with me because she had seen the special military operations and she wanted some advice about how to do it in a way that was going to cause the least friction with the Secret Service. And she was being a responsible person. So I had never met her. And she wanted to deliver it on, I believe it's January 7th is Orthodox Christmas. And the idea was that Russian soldiers kept stealing washing machines and other appliances that they found in Ukraine. And so she was going to deliver one so that they didn't have to steal them to the embassy. And I thought it was witty and good-natured, and it had all the right kinds of mischief attached to it. Oh, and the other thing that was cool about it was that the washing machine, which was beautiful, by the way, it was a really well-done papier-mâché washing machine. The washing machine had a QR code on it so that somebody walking down the street would say, hey, what's this washing machine doing? And snap the QR code and get a good account of, Russian theft of property and the like and war crimes in Ukraine. And so we had a brief exchange, and she told me she was going to show that there. And I said, this is crazy. Let me film it. And then I'll release a video, the video will get much more attention than the washing machine will on its own. And so I showed up there with a camera and met this lovely young artist with her washing machine. And we did a little interview, and then she carries the washing machine across the street and puts it there, and we film it, and we film her talking to some people about it because it immediately had the effect that she intended. And then I figured, so here was my dastardly little scheme. As soon as she left, I knew because they'd come out and destroyed the sunflowers that they would come out and destroy the washing machine. And so I figured all that needed to happen was she would leave and I would kind of go across the street and they would come out and destroy it. So she left and I went across the street and the Russians threw me a curveball. They did not come out and destroy it. They called it into the Secret Service as a bomb threat.
A little different.
Yeah. So the Secret Service seals off the neighborhood and starts, they took it quite seriously. And they would not listen to my protestations that, no, it's not a bomb, it's a papier-mâché washing machine, because they had one question for me under those circumstances, which is, did you bring it here? And the answer to that is, no, I didn't bring it here. I know who did, but they thought I was kind of covered, because I wouldn't say who she was, because I didn't actually want them sending police cars to her house and arresting her. So it took me a while to get her on the phone and tell her you need to come back and clear this up with the Secret Service. In the meantime, they'd sent the bomb squad in to defuse the papier-mâché washing machine. Anyway, Liam shows up and they have a protracted conversation and by the end of which the Secret Service was telling her that she should use the pictures of the washing machine for her art graduate school portfolio. And it all worked out very well. And I think the video of it is lovely, also available on YouTube. But yeah, no, that's a good example of how I think the special military operations have kind of created a space for people who want to be creative about, figuring out how to express themselves to the Russian embassy, to do so and to think about it in sort of grand terms. And so a bunch of people who want to do that sort of thing have gotten in touch with me about kind of how to do it in ways that are preferably not going to require the bomb squad and are going to maximize visibility and impact.
So do you have any plans for the future?
Well, I am working on a crazy scheme, which I am not sure I can get done, but I'm working on it, to rent an apartment in one of the adjacent buildings to the embassy so that the spotlights have a permanent home. And
it's not a cheap neighborhood either.
It's not a cheap neighborhood. It's going to cost, I don't know, $1,700 a month or something.
Oh, yeah.
But I want to use the apartment to house refugees and spotlights. That's the goal. And whether I can do that in a fashion that I can possibly afford financially and that the terms of the relevant lease will allow remains to be seen. But I am working on it, and those who want to follow and help with this project should follow the Dog Shirt Daily Substack, where I document all the special military operations, and which is at dogshirtdaily.com. And right now, if you become a paid subscriber to Dog Shirt Daily, all of the proceeds from that are going to fund the acquisition of this apartment.
And if there are any Ukrainian landlords paying attention or listening, please reach out. So to kind of turn this back to you, walking through your life and career, you started working for the Legal Times and then was at the Washington Post as a legal editorial writer. picture yourself as early career Ben, and Russia invades Ukraine back then. Do you think you would have done something like this?
No. It's an interesting question. So, while I was a working reporter, I wouldn't have been allowed to. And while I was an editorial writer at the Post, there were all kinds of restrictions on our political activity. And I could have written editorials or whatever, but, always in the arch tone of and the first person plural, we think that war crimes should stop. So I was never in a position to do this sort of thing. I was also frankly allergic to activism. I have always thought of myself as the least activist person around. And a bunch of things over the last few years have changed that. One of which is, frankly, being in a position between my role at Brookings, which essentially my job is to be me, and my role at Lawfare, where I kind of get to set the rules. And Lawfare has rules in people's interactions with Lawfare, but it doesn't try to regulate the rest of their lives. And so, we have people who work for Lawfare and in one case, and drift in and out of government, right? We have people who write for Lawfare and are involved in cases that we cover, right? So this is an environment in which we try to be upfront about our conflicts of interest, but at the end of the day, we're not Lawfare people and only Lawfare people. And I think that rule applies to me as much as it applies to everyone else. And this is really the first role I've ever had where that was kind of true. And so I've been able over the last few years to be much freer about all kinds of outside activities that I would previously have not been willing to allow myself to contemplate.
And this is kind of going back a bit, but I know what prompted the special military operations was the invasion. But what was the genesis of it? How did you decide, yes, I'm going to take lights? This is what sparked that idea?
Yeah, so in a strange way, it's an homage to a gentleman named Robin Bell, who during the Trump administration, Robin is a whom I've never met, although we've spoken on the phone once. He, during the early part of the Trump administration, projected the emoluments clause of the Constitution onto the Trump Hotel. And I thought that was pretty brilliant. He followed it up with some other, I would say, left politics, anti-Trump kind of projections, all against buildings they were mostly against the Trump Hotel. I thought it was a very clever form of local protest. It provoked a lot of discussion, and I liked it, and it stuck in my mind. And a few days after the invasion, and I'd have to go back to my Twitter feed, which is now no longer there in order to date this precisely. But it was a few days after the election, I drove by the embassy again, just because it's in my neighborhood. And I noticed for the first time that it was a giant white-faced building that looked like a movie screen. And
it's almost asking.
It was almost asking. So I tweeted that, it's like a movie screen. It's begging for somebody to project the Ukrainian flag on it. And lots and lots. And I was thinking of Robin Bell, and I may have even said paging, Robin Bell or something. And I noticed that a very large number of people commented on this, retweeted it, thought it was a great idea. But the weeks went by and nobody did it. And then my friend Matteo, who is a college kid somewhere in one of those elite Northeastern colleges, whom I know Matteo from the In Lieu of Fun audience. He's a thoughtful guy who shows up on the show and asks good questions. And he texted me, I think I know how to do this, and he sent me my tweet. And so Matteo and I started texting back and forth about how to do it. And before I knew it, he had scored to lend him 16 giant spotlights from a local company that does lighting. And they'd lent him the equipment. And I managed to get somebody at the top who lives in one of these buildings to let us use her roof. And all of a sudden, Matteo and his friend Avery, who is now Lawfare's intern, we were all of a sudden driving a van full of, big spotlights around. And so we did the first one just because nobody else had done it or nobody else had responded. It turns out actually somebody had done it. Their social media presence was so minimal that nobody had noticed. So we did the first one, and the reaction from the Russians, which was to try to, chase the spotlight around, and that produced that cat and mouse video, was so delightful that we just kept doing it. And we've ever since then been, shrinking the equipment, trying to make it more and more mobile. I now can do it, in the trunk of my car with much better accuracy, and I can write words. So it's like, there's a Moore's law. It gets smaller and smaller and more powerful. But really the animating spirit was, I have to live with this thing in my neighborhood, and I hate it. And how can I make life unpleasant for the people in there who are representing this government? And it's not actually more complicated than that.
Wow. Yeah. And so kind of pulling back a bit, if somebody doesn't know you and only knows you by your titles, senior fellow at Brookings.
Yeah, I seem all respectable and shit.
Oh, yeah, you seem very respectable and shit. Yeah, exactly. And in your free time, you're also the guy running around with the projector, conducting these special military operations. If you were a cub reporter at the Legal Times or anywhere else, how would you cover this story?
I think you have a choice in this situation. It's very, very hard to think about with respect to oneself, which is why people generally shouldn't be assignment editors of stories about themselves. You can cover the event. Protesters shine lights on embassy, which is what the Washington Post did at the time we did the first operation. Or you can cover me. And I try not to let people do the latter. I'm not going to not answer people's questions. I'm not going to hide what I'm doing. But I do try to, first of all, always keep the subject on what we're projecting and what the significance of the images is. When we can work with local organizations to support what they're doing, I do prefer to do it that way. I think, what the local Ukrainian community has to say is much more important than me. And I've tried to not seek press attention for the operations as opposed to the messages. When we have done things that I've tried to draw attention to, it's somebody else's voice. It's, Luda Huntsman reading an essay by Katya Savchenko, right? We're the facilitator of that. Avery and I are getting the images up there. We're arranging the lighting so that it works. We're filming it. And I bring a certain degree of personality to it that, people follow the special military operations because it's this thing that I do. But the last thing I want is for it to be about me. And whenever it is, you always have to ask, wait a minute, how much of this is ego and how much of this is actually being helpful? And there's a complicated mix there because at some level, the goal here is to, create and sustain attention to this issue. And personality and charisma do drive attention. But, there's also the other side that if people are thinking about me instead of thinking about Ukraine, that's not a win. And I want them to be thinking about that building. And I want them to be thinking about the message that we're putting on that building. I want them to be thinking about the people who are being injured, killed, displaced. And I want them to be thinking about the people whose voices they're not hearing. And so it's a delicate little dance because honestly, if the Cub reporter comes to me and says, hey, I want to do a story about special military operations, that's great. But I don't want that Cub reporter to spend that time drawing attention to me. I want, the person who is least often on those live streams is me. The camera, I'm holding the camera, but it's usually pointed away from me. It's often my voice on it. But the goal is to make people think about something else. And so, it's a complicated relationship, and it's one that I've, continued to struggle with, and that I don't think there's an optimal answer to.
You're the hook, and the story is the platform of raising Ukrainian voices.
Yeah, exactly. And look, if we're not, another example of this, something we did do on Lawfare was Live from Ukraine, where, I'm the catalyst for it. I'm the host, right? But every single one of those episodes is featuring a Ukrainian voice on the conflict. And so do a lot of people listen to it because they're interested in me? Yes. If all they get is me, then I'm not doing my job.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Ben Wittes, for this lovely conversation.
Thank you for having me.
I definitely learned a lot, and I can't wait to go to a special military operation.
We should do one this week in your honor.
I would absolutely love that. Immediately, yes. So for our chatter listeners, it's tradition that the guest answers a question from the chatter box. So Ben, what advice would you give to your 20-year-old self?
Start wearing dog shirts earlier.
I love it.
I went through this whole phase where I started, feeling like I had to dress respectably. And it was a bad idea. It was 25 years of bad idea. And then it was only during the pandemic and during In Lieu of Fun that I was just like, it's all dog shirts all the way down. And I think I would have been happier through my 30s and 40s if I had just never done the suit thing.
I've only ever known you as dog shirt Ben. How many dog shirts do you have?
Probably about 30.
I think we should get team ones, Lawfare ones.
You know, I have the dog shirt program at Brookings, which is I buy a dog shirt for any staff at Brookings who promises to wear them to work.
Absolutely.
And, so far, I have, I think, 4 dog shirt wearing people at Brookings, and so we're working on it. The dog shirt revolution is coming. It's just a question of whether it's going to run over you or whether you're going to be part of the wave that crashes over it.
The unstoppable force of dog shirts. All right. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining me.
A pleasure.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter @ThatWasChatter.